Our panelists, starting on that end, Professor Mark Husbands of the Hope College Religion Department. Next to him, Ken Myers of Mars Hill Audio Journal. Felicia Song, whom you just heard, and her husband Ed Song, who teaches moral philosophy at LSU. I've got to confess I have kind of a soft spot in my heart for young philosophers. My own oldest son, Daniel, just started teaching philosophy at Calvin. You just got to love these guys who are trying to make it in the humanities in this economy, you know. And actually, since we haven't heard from Ed, I wanted to give him an opportunity to reflect on what he's been hearing from our speakers on this question of identity, and I think you said agency, is right. Okay, so we're going to start things off, and then we'll open it to the audience for any of the panelists, and you can either direct a question to an individual, or you can just say, I'd like to hear from anybody who wants to respond to this. So, Ed, go ahead.
Great, thanks. I'm really, really happy to be here. I've just been astounded by the hospitality that this community has shown to us, and so it's been a really nice visit. After this session, I'll be passing around a hat for a fund funding us poor philosophers trying to make it in the humanities. Your contributions will be very much appreciated.
We'll set up a Facebook page.
Yeah, that's right. You can tweet us, struggling young philosophers. So I thought what I would do today, my work concerns issues in moral and political philosophy. I don't have any kind of scholarly interest in technology. So I thought what I would do just really, really quickly is try to deploy some philosophical tools or concepts that are helpful for me, and I think attach in interesting ways to the talks that have been going on this weekend. And so the title of the conference is True Community and True Selves. It's a conference about the relationship between individuals and community. It's a conference about issues of identity. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about issues of identity and how they connect to issues of community and technology. For me, in talking about issues of identity, that's a question of trying to understand who we are as people, what makes us people, what makes us the distinctive people that we are, and how those self-conceptions connect to how we act, to moral agency and action, more mundane kinds of action. And to me, the most persuasive account of identity in the philosophical literature is an account of narrative identity. And so the suggestion is that what fundamentally shapes us as human beings, and then more specifically what fundamentally shapes us as the particular individual people that we are, is narrative or stories, that we are fundamentally storytelling creatures. We make sense of ourselves in the shape of narratives and story. This kind of account gets developed by a lot of people, but specifically the touchstones that I have in mind are Alistair McIntyre, and then more recently a University of Illinois Chicago philosopher named Mariah Schechtman. And the suggestion again is just that narrative is a basic, essential, inescapable category for human understanding. We are storytelling creatures. We make sense of ourselves through stories. And the shape that these stories can come in, they can be really, really big stories, or they can be really, really small stories. So for example, to borrow an example that Felicia used in her chapel talk, which I guess actually came from me, so I'm just taking it back. So when you go to, there's the kind of script that you deploy when you're in a checkout line, right? There's a kind of a script that we follow, the role that we play. So the cashier plays a role and the customer plays a role. There's a kind of script that you deploy and rely upon in all different kinds of social situations. I mean, the scripts might vary regionally. The script in Louisiana apparently is different than it is in northern New Jersey. Instances of social awkwardness happen when you aren't sure what script to play. Right? So you think about the awkward social encounters in your life, and the problem there is that you're not sure what the setting or the scenario is, and so you're sort of like, am I the professional? Is this a young casual conversation? Is this a formal conversation? So that's like a small narrative, but of course those small narratives are embedded in bigger narratives, and sometimes really, really big narratives, and how we ultimately understand ourselves. But if you introduce yourself to somebody and you say, well, tell me about yourself. Well, I grew up in a small town, and my whole life, my aspiration was to get out of the small town and to move to the big city and to experience the excitement, right? So there's a kind of a story that you're telling that shapes your outlook on life, that informs the kind of decisions that you make. And then that kind of story is embedded in a bigger story. Maybe the biggest story that you tell about yourself is that you see yourself as a person who is a servant of the creating and redeeming God. And you see your life, the purpose of your life is to participate in the redemptive work that God is unfolding in the world. Right? So that's sort of a big grand narrative, and we can tell smaller narratives about ourselves. And some of these narratives, they can be good and they can be bad stories. They can be bad stories maybe because the kind of narratives that we tell actually don't satisfy real deep human needs or longings. Or maybe they're the kind of narratives that actually short circuit the narrative capacities for us as people. So one kind of narrative that's very common in the United States, of course, is this narrative about the sovereign individual who is independent of other kinds of people, who shows his or her worth through his superiority in actions, who's able to pull himself up by his bootstraps and overcome any kind of situation without help on others. This is an extremely powerful narrative, and it's a bad narrative for a lot of different reasons, but one of the ways in which is that it short-circuits the very fact that we are narrative creatures, and it undermines the conditions that enable us to be informed by stories and to tell stories about ourselves. And one of the reasons why is that the main source of the narratives that we get is from our culture and from our communities. Right? So the communities, we don't just get narratives from anywhere. In some ways, the various different kinds of narratives that we have access to are somewhat limited. There's not just any story that you could tell about yourself, but it comes from somewhere. And it comes, and we're trained into that part by communities. Communities are the sources of our narratives, and they're also the context or the stage in which we play those narratives out. So communities are essential for this narrative aspect of human agency, and we can't become fully human without particular kinds of communities. Now, one thing about technology is that technology can be corrosive of this relationship. One point that both Ken and Felicia were making is that technology isn't just a tool, right? It's not some value-neutral tool that you can have and you can use for good or for ill. One of Ken's big points yesterday was that it's a metaphor, and it's a metaphor that informs the way that we think about ourselves. Another way of thinking about that is that it's not just a metaphor, but it's a metaphor that's part of a narrative, right? And the technologies that we use and how we use them, right? It's not just a tool, but in fact, it carries with it this whole story about human life, about the purposes of human life, about what's good and valuable, about how we should spend our time, about how we should treat other people. And I think this aspect is helpful for understanding how it is that various different kind of technologies come to shape us in various different ways. So like one question that we can ask is that as we use and consume technology, we can ask ourselves, well, what story is being told here? I got an iPhone, the new iPhone, in August. I love this thing. Though I don't hardly ever use it for social media purposes. But you can ask yourself, so what story is this telling? Right? What is it saying about the purposes of human life? What is it saying about the goods that we should care about? What does Twitter say? What story is Twitter telling about human beings, or Facebook, or iPads, or all of these various different things? What story are they telling? And is that a story that we should be concerned about? Right? And so this isn't to say that we should never touch these things, but we should always be asking ourselves what stories these various different technologies are telling, and how they're shaping the way that we think about ourselves, how they're shaping the own narrative that we tell about how we understand who we are as people and how we engage in the world.
All right, thanks, Ed. And maybe that prompted a question as well. There's a microphone up here. If that looks too difficult to get to, you can probably be heard from your seat. Although we're also recording, so I think the microphone helps out in that regard. Questions from the audience for any of our panelists or all of them?
I'll just ask from here if that's okay.
Okay.
Curious for those of you who have children or intend to or hope to, how do you help your kids to defend them from, introduce them to, and help them navigate this new world that you described?
Well, they all have children. Yeah, my children are 20. Yeah, my children are 20, 24, and 26. So they have been raised as this new age has been dawning. And I think that, I mean, there were other technologies, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, Christian parents were worried about television. But I think we began early on with trying to inculcate a sense of deliberateness with them. First of all, with regard to television, we decided early on that they always had to ask permission to watch something, even if it was something they'd watched with permission earlier. And part of what we wanted to do was to get them used to making a decision, rather than just turning on the TV without thinking that they were going to do it, but recognizing I am now choosing to do this rather than doing it habitually. And well into their teens, they just assumed that was, and I remember one day I thought, this is really remarkable that this is happening, and realizing that there are many parents who govern the use of the refrigerator more than they govern the use of television now, and certainly more than they govern the use of the internet now, which is really remarkable in some ways. So I think that now we also, our kids grew up without the social peer pressure of participating in fashionable technological practices because we homeschooled our kids. So they didn't feel compelled to, they didn't feel that kind of pressure. When they went to school, that made them kind of weird. And so they had to be, actually this is a good kind of general principle. I just interviewed recently Ken DeCreasy Dean, who teaches at Princeton Seminary in youth, church, and culture. She basically teaches about youth ministry. And at the very beginning of the interview, she's written a book called Almost Christian, which is about how churches are increasingly turning out young people who are Christianish. But she says it's because the culture of the church is Christianish. It's not really thickly Christian. There's not a thick Christian narrative that's governing the church's own life, and so these kids are becoming Christianish and hence more and more influenced by the culture. But she said, parents don't want to hear the fact that if you're going to raise kids who are really faithful followers of Jesus, they're going to be out of sync with dominant American culture. And parents just don't want their kids not to fit in. Parents want their kid to be faithful followers of Jesus, willing to martyr themselves, but they also want them to fit in as smoothly as possible so they'll have as many friends as possible. And she said, that's just not real. So I guess the biggest, the meta consideration is how willing are parents to raise kids who are out of step with a disordered culture. And I think that requires some confidence, and I think it also requires that parents not do it alone, that they band together with many other parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles. And one last thing on this, Mark DeVries, who's done a lot of work in youth ministry and wrote a book years ago called Family-Based Youth Ministry, and his principal argument is that churches need to move away from traditional youth ministry and think about family ministry. And the basic two principles: parents are the principal spiritual guides for children, typically. And secondly, churches are extended families. So the whole church community should see itself as having the obligation of raising kids and being the community in which the first person plural pronoun is naturally used by the kids. When they think we, they don't think of their age cohort. When they think we, they think of that community. Now that's a difficult ideal to achieve, but I really think that produces a kind of consciousness that not just these kinds of questions about how to use technologies, but questions about shapes of relationships and vocation and our attitude toward money and sex and everything else becomes, I think, easier to navigate.
A quick response is we have a computer that's in the family room. What difference does that make? Well, when you combine that fact with sort of a family principle that my children are not actually permitted to date during high school, that raises an interesting dilemma. I have one of my children has a close friendship with a young woman who lives in England, whom he met last summer. They Skype each other fairly regularly, and they do so, he has to do so in sort of the family room, which means she sees his little brother walking past the computer screen and sees me walking by, and it involves us in this relationship in a more natural, I think, helpful way than encouraging him to make this a kind of private, secret relationship. And of course, the good thing is they are remarkably earnest in doing something which you might think is odd, but they prod each other to post the most important passages of Scripture they've read that week on each other's wall. But we know this because it's out in the open as opposed to being hidden.
You want to add anything, Felicia?
We have a 6-year-old and a 1-year-old. And I guess the two things I would mention is, I think, modeling technology's uses. There, I know very clearly that our 6-year-old is watching, because I remember one time she had a stethoscope in her ears, but she said, "I'm going jogging with my iPod," because like, oh, okay. So I know, and I know she's watching us. And when we made our dual purchases of the iPhone, we actually had a lot of conversations about whether we were going to do this and what it would mean, and just what the kids were going to think of seeing us with this little device. Hannah also has 2 friends, first grade and second grade friends, that just got their own iPod Touches, and she's asked for them herself. And so one of the things that I explained to her was that we weren't going to get her one for Christmas next year, or the Christmas after that, or the Christmas after that. So she shouldn't ask again. Like, it just wasn't going to happen. But that the reason why was because anytime she wanted to play with a game, she could ask Mom and Dad for the games on our phones, and if it was the right time, she could play. But that there were alternatives, and that for us, we felt that there were so many other things that she loved to do, and that there are these alternatives that she should engage in. And so in terms of parenting, I find myself thinking about trying to present compelling alternatives to her, and letting her realize there are other things that are extremely satisfying, right? That are very competitive against these other things, And I think that's what I feel like. That's what happens to a lot of parents, is that they think, well, everyone has it, so I'm going to get them this, and I don't know. I don't know if it's a lack of imagination or feeling the forces, the pressure. I think a lot of parents feel like, well, we live in a technological age. We need to give them this now so that they know how to type and learn to play with a Wii and things like that. In my opinion, I'm like,
doesn't take long.
No, exactly. Like, we're the dumb ones, right? We're the ones that are too old to figure out how to use the little Wii thing. Like, you give it to the kid and they know how to use it in minutes. So I don't think that's a concern.
Okay, thanks. Panelists. Yes, Chuck.
So I've got a question about, it's a 2-part question. First of all, I think many of us have this perception that technology has advanced much more rapidly than it used to be. Right? I think about when I was growing up, if I wanted to know something, I had to go to a library or ask somebody that knew. And now you can just, anywhere you are, you can get that information. anytime I want to talk to somebody, I can pull out my cell phone. I mean, to me, that the world has fundamentally changed because of that, and it's been very rapid. So the first part of my question is that just a perception that we have that technology is more rapidly, or if you look at it in terms of 100 years ago versus 150 years ago, would people saw that difference as drastic? And the second part of the question is, one of my concerns with technology has always been, because it's been so rapidly changing, I don't think we have any clue what it is doing and will do to society, and I believe that it'll be too late when we figure it out. So I want your thoughts on that.
Well, I think in some ways the curve is kind of exponential. It is changing and changing faster. In other ways, I wonder, thinking, I don't know if you were there last night, but I quoted C.S. Lewis's comment about how the Industrial Revolution changed the consciousness of Europe so that new things were considered better things. That's a huge change, to move from assuming that venerable, trustworthy, tried and true things are valuable to moving to assume that new things are better things. That's a change in consciousness that seems to me to be bigger than the change in computing power between a Mac Plus and a new MacBook Pro. So I think there's a sense in which some huge changes are already behind us, and now on the other hand, the kinds of social rearrangements that Felicia talked about are novel in some ways, but on the other hand, they're not entirely novel. The idea of autonomy, of what was it, networked individualism. I mean, in a sense, we have new technologies to enable that, but I don't think that mentality is entirely new. We have new capacities to achieve it in ways we couldn't a generation ago, but I'm not sure that mentality is entirely new. So I'd say that there's a sense in which there is a certain kind of advance, but it may be an advance on the same line as opposed to changing lines, which is even a more radical sort of thing. I also would encourage us to years ago I interviewed someone, and he said, whenever I hear the word progress, I always ask, progress toward what? So the question is not just the pace of change, but the change in what direction toward what end. And I think we often make the mistake of assuming because we have new capacities or intensified capacities, that it's a kind of advance in the nature of things. But what if, in fact, the ends for which, say, communications technologies should be used are, well, we have to ask what sorts of ends do we really want to be in place? Do we want the ends of encouraging a rich inner life? Do we want the ends of encouraging rich, multifaceted relationships? Or do we want ends which serve for flatter kinds of relationships, or more convenient or controllable kinds of relationships? So I always think when people talk about progress or advancement, we really need to stop and say, well, what ends are actually being achieved? And then your last question about, I think you're right that we don't anticipate the changes, but I think we can. We do have resources to say what sorts of human goods do we want to enable as the church and within the community of the church? Because we can't control the world, but we do have some obligation to try to be the church faithfully, and so to within our own community, we have some notions of what ends we're trying to sustain, and as changes arise, we can evaluate some of those things. And that's, I think, what we're trying to do this weekend, and ask. We don't know where it's going, but we know where we ought to be, and what can we do now to be closer to where we ought to be than we are now? I think that's the way I would think about it.
As a humanist, and as someone who loves Guinness, I would say that the internet and technology has the allure of promise with so much access to information and a wide array of information. You get the impression that you can get something of real substance. And I think all you get is the head of Guinness. The promise of the substance isn't there, right? And I think we need to make a distinction between information and knowledge. And I think so, I'm really heartened and encouraged by the fact that, one of our research librarians is here in the room. I think you still desperately need the library because even with Google Books, I'm sure you've all had the frustration, you're reading along and this makes sense and you're so happy you haven't had to traipse over to the library to get it, but it's there in front of you and you go to the next page and that's exactly what you want and this page is not accessible. And then even if you wanted to find the footnote, the reference, why are they saying that? Who are they engaging with? How are they evaluating the material? You can't find it. You've got to find your way to the library. And I think that's a great thing because next to that book is often another one and another one. And you would not have made those connections, but they're there. And often the internet does not help you. Google does not help you. It's just too much surface. And I think we need the community of scholarship, and the library is a very valuable repository of sources that have been evaluated and carefully brought together that we desperately need. And we can't get just alone with someone else's rendition of what we need.
Another question, yes.
My question goes back a little bit to Facebook and concerns of identity. Something that struck me when I signed up and took the plunge was that all my friends were now in the same place, and no matter what I posted, everyone from different walks and different phases of my life would see the same thing. And I've been thinking about this a lot because it seems on the one hand that this could be a return to sort of a small town identity. Everybody knows, everyone knows your reputation. Everything you say, everyone finds out. And we've lost that by sort of our individualism in big cities, that kind of alienation, this part of modern life. But I also have a concern that in terms of the development of identity, that kind of consistency could be detrimental. I was just reading something interesting that when we actually do that, we start mimicking each other's gestures, intonation, and that kind of thing. And I'm wondering, I'd like your thoughts on that, sort of this consistency versus multiplicity, which we usually see as a bad thing, multiplicity of identity. But I'm wondering if growth depends on these little adaptations that we make when we encounter people privately and individually instead of broadcasting ourselves. So I'm grappling with whether consistency is such a good thing.
I think partly what Elizabeth is touching on is the notion that when you're on Facebook and Twitter, etc., you're creating your personal brand. And I think, as I was listening to Felicia's lovely presentation this morning, the overwhelming kind of sense behind this, and it's certainly in the book Bowling Alone, is the hidden thing we've not touched on in all of this, is the feature of loneliness. Right? I don't think Facebook and Twitter are essentially expressions of narcissism. Maybe at a developmental stage they are, but as one grows a bit, I'm not quite sure they're about narcissism or promoting myself. I think it's masking a much more serious question about it's the fear of being lonely, of not having a genuine connectedness to people for whom I matter and they matter to me. And so that kind of identity lies behind, doesn't it, hidden, obscured by the brand making of Facebook.
Can I say one thing? So one thing, just with regard to the kinds of stories that inform the way we interact with people. So when I interact with Felicia, say, there's sort of one role that I adopt that's different than the one that I adopt with my friends or with my daughter or with my parents, right? So and when you move to something like Facebook, right? Now, what role do you adopt, right? Mm-hmm. And I know, say for people whose friends include their parent, which seems totally weird to me, totally weird to me. It's like how they manage their identity. So you have siblings and parents. You have college buddies. A lot of people use them for professional purposes, and they really are using Facebook to build their brand. So they're using it for economic purposes. And so you have all these different roles. And then so how do you manage your identity online when you're addressing all these different audiences? I think you tend to take on sort of like this new narrative, who I am on Facebook. And well, who are you on Facebook? Part of that narrative is going to be informed by the particular kind of technology. So it needs to be catchy and fun, and I think we tend to think of it in terms of the tools of branding and advertising, right? So it should be fun, it should be catchy, it should be humorous, we should surprise people. And then a question, so we assume this new role, and then one question is, okay, and so how is that role sort of affecting the deeper kind of narrative that we tell about ourselves and how we understand ourselves? And is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Do you want to respond to this question, Felicia?
I love that question. I'm still thinking about it. I agree. I mean, I think that when I have conversations with particular people, they bring out a part of me that is not brought out with that other friend. And that your point about growth and identity, that's what I'm chewing on, because it's heavy stuff. It's very, I don't know. I totally agree, and I think dovetailing on what Ed's saying, people say that Facebook is a lot more like Christmas letters, right? Especially as moms, right? It's like you post when so-and-so took their first step and things like that. We went to Disney World, all that kind of stuff, right? And so it's not that we're not used to doing these kinds of things in other places, but it's, Christmas letters come once a year, and there's a narrative for it, right? We all know like what should go into a Christmas letter. Like you don't put in that what the latest argument you had with your spouse, right? Like
Bobby's out on bail.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So there is a story.
I was arrested for drunk driving.
And it comes once a year, whereas Facebook has a different pace depending on how you use it, right? So, I guess my only comment is I agree, but I don't know.
I think your comparison to a small town is interesting, but a couple of differences is, first of all, in the small town, everybody has the same friends. So what we have here is you are a town of one, and then every other person has a different town, and everybody lives in a different town. So rather than you being known by all these people who actually know you together and actually talk about you when you're not there, and actually begin to form an understanding of who you are that probably is communicated to you at some point, and possibly in a good way, possibly in a constructive way. So your identity is not just formed by you being the center of this node, of this network node. You're a node in the network. It's much more organic than that. You're part of an ecosystem rather than a network. And the ecosystem, all the pieces are interacting with each other, and you're part of that total interaction. That's a totally different kind of thing. The other thing that occurs to me, and I wanted to get this out on the table at some point, on this question of community, and that is the question of authority. How is authority exercised in these new communities? Because, and this relates to identity, I've been rereading James Davison Hunter's The Death of Character, in which he makes the point that character is shaped by morally authoritative communities. We learn to respond to taboos and permissions, and our conscience is shaped because of the fact that we're part of a community with a story, and the story has warnings in it and blessings, and so it seems to me that one of the, and again, this is not a new thing, the community of the virtual community it doesn't introduce a new dilemma, but it seems to me that it intensifies the idea of relationships without any sense of moral obligation other than what might make you feel personally guilty. So that that's another area in which I think it's very, very different from a small town, in which the small town would be the place in which you have moral obligations and are shaped as a bearer of conscience also.
Okay, Mark?
The way to connect some of this up is to, and I'm thinking here of even Ed's opening remarks, is this question of narrative or story, is to ask what philosophers would call about ontology. What's the ground of being? How are these stories true? Is one way of getting at this. And my sort of opening gambit with Ed would be to say, I think you're absolutely right about the way in which stories function for us. We create an identity by telling stories. And he hinted at this, but I think a book that is kind of a bit dusty now but still needs to be recovered is Hans Frey's Eclipse of the Biblical Narrative, where he argues that part of the problem is it's not that narrative is bad, it's that we've reversed the whole pattern. It's instead of finding who we are within the primary narrative of the biblical text, we now try, if at all possible, to find a bit of the text, Scripture, and try to fit it into our more primary narrative, which is ourself. And I think that's the seductive notion about tweets and Facebook and saying and all of these postings is I'm desperately trying to construct an identity for myself by posting things to the world, revealing parts of a story I want. Rather than saying, no, as Christians, we only know who we are. Our ontology is rooted in the action of God, and we are part of this covenantal people. So it has an authority over us.
So we are really trying to figure out who we are. That is, not just who I am, but who are we as a people.
Right.
And who I am is contingent on who we are.
Mm-hmm. And more primary question is who we are is we are, I mean, it's the first clause of the Catechism. I am a child of God. That's the primary identity.
Sounds like there may be a book in this question. A couple of hands up over here, Sam. Then we have about maybe 5 more minutes, and we'll try to get as many questions in as possible in the next few minutes. So we'll keep the questions and responses brief, and we can get more in.
Constructing a self, and creating a narrative that we can choose to be a part of, or acknowledging the narrative of the biblical text as something we choose to participate in, rather than being participants whether we know it or not, or being informed by that narrative. I'm thinking about the role of the church. What does the church play in this? And how, because in the digital world, we lose the presence of things. And in Mark Husband's in his talk, he said physical things matter. Augustine acknowledged that. And Ken Myers, again, presence matters. Felicia, the same thing. And we lose that in the digital world where we encounter face-to-face human beings and community is forming us. And my husband wrote a paper talking about Bonhoeffer, and I know who I am because there is a community outside of myself, and that important to me. But when the church in these days are so transient because there's a matter of, but as we are shaped by our society and culture, where we are given choice and prerogative and preference, we can leave a church. We can leave a community and go to another one that fits us and suits us better, or suits our needs or wants. So what do we do when the church is even fostering or allowing, I guess, these characteristics that diminish kind of the parish notion of, or the general story, this is what you get. These are the people that you love, and you love you, and it's not easy, but it's a sense of commitment, and I don't know. But, I mean, what do we do with that when that's in the very place where that shouldn't be? How do you address that?
There's a lot of interesting reflection on the question of stability. And I just interviewed a young man who's part of, I guess he's called a new monastic movement, a Southern Baptist in Raleigh, North Carolina, called The Wisdom of Stability. And so there's a lot of interesting reflection on this. And I think we're realizing that community also isn't just about relationships, but it's about place and time. And so real community is a limited number of people who are together for a long enough period of time in the same place. And I really do think we need to re-examine our assumptions about even our assumptions about vocation, so that rather than saying, here are the gifts God has given me, where can I go to exercise them most fully? I think we need to ask, here are the gifts God has given me in this community. How can I serve the community that I've been a part of? Not that that's a legalistic necessity, but that at least ought to be on the radar. Is there a way I can serve the people that I'm already tied to? Because my life will be richer if I can stay here for 20 or 30 or 40 years, and my kids can be part of the same connection. So I think that that's just something we're going to have to be very deliberate about. It's not going to happen. I mean, it used to happen of necessity. It doesn't happen of necessity. So there's a certain kind of neo-something or other, neo-rootedness that has to, but it has to, and it has to be deliberate.
Anyone else want to respond to that question in the next minute or so? I think, even given what Mark Husbands said about his chock-full email inbox, he'd probably delete a few so he could get emails from you and answer questions. I think Ken and Felicia and Ed also have email and would also be willing to respond to questions. And they're going to be around a bit longer today as well. Let's give them a hand, and then I've got a couple more announcements. Thank you.